Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and good night. Welcome to Prog Chattery 777. We've been talking about Jethro Tull. If you've been following along, I've been doing little chats about each and every Jethro Tull album, as well as the Ian Anderson solo albums. In the last video I did, we talked about Catfish Rising from 1991. And chronologically, the next album that I should be talking about is Divinities. Unfortunately, that is the one album that I do not own, and I call myself a fan. Oh, I'm very embarrassed to admit that I don't own Divinities. That is Ian Anderson's second solo record. I've heard bits and pieces of it. I'm not totally ignorant to the album. I know bits of it, but I'm obviously not going to come out here and do a review or chat about it. I'm not going to chat about that album specifically because I don't own it. I have no right to discuss that album, I feel. But I'm going to pick that album up. I'll do a chat about it eventually. So instead, I thought I would talk a bit about Ian Anderson's flute playing. In the other videos, some of the other albums that I've talked about, you've probably noticed I haven't talked a whole lot about his flute playing. Now obviously, the one-legged flute player, that's a big part of Jethro Tull's image. And obviously Ian Anderson was a very good flute player. He was the first guy to use it as a rock instrument back in the day. But the thing that's worth noting, basically Anderson started playing the flute, a couple of weeks before the first Jethro Tull album, This Was released. So he kind of learned how to play the flute on the road. He never had any formal training with it. And although he got very, very good and he developed a very unique style, he didn't really properly know how to play the flute. All throughout the 60s, 70s, and 80s, he was kind of just playing the flute his own way that he made up. And like I said, I'm not knocking it. I really, really like his style. He had a very rhythmic style. In the early days, on the, stand-up, benefit, Aqualung era, his flute playing got pretty wild. He would be, he'd be scatting into it, he'd be snorting into it, he'd be doing all kinds of funny sounds, and that kind of became, that was very typical of the early flute playing. And as Tull went along through the 70s, I think he started using the flute a lot more as a writing instrument. I've spent a lot more time talking about Anderson's songwriting and his guitar playing. And I think the flute is an important part of his songwriting. Like I said, Anderson's got a wonderful knack for beautiful melodies. And really good melodies, and I think a lot of those he did write on the flute, particularly in the late 70s with the folk trilogy, Songs from the Wood, Heavy Horses, and Stormwatch. His flute playing became a little less crazy and a little less he started writing more of those Celtic melodies, which I think it suited his style of the flute, because, that early style was very rhythmic, there was a lot of, the rhythm was a big part of his attack, the way that he played the flute. And those Celtic melodies, I think, were a natural fit to the techniques that he had developed for himself. So that's notable. But the big story, the big thing that I want to talk about in this little video is, in the mid-90s, Anderson took the time to learn the flute properly, which is a big thing, and it's very unusual. It's a weird thing talking about, especially because all those classic albums in the 70s had already been done, and the flute playing on those, it is what it is, and it's still good. The flute playing suits those early albums. But starting from Divinities and Roots to Branches in 95, we get Ian Anderson, the virtuoso flautist. He was never a virtuoso. He was the rock flute player before. He had this unique style in that, but after he took the time to learn the instrument and learn the proper fingerings and the proper techniques, his ability on the flute is just monstrous. You just need to listen. I'll talk more in the next video. We'll talk about Roots to Branches. But his flute playing just got so much better, and he started using different kinds of flutes. He started using like bamboo flutes, different flutes from different cultures and whatnot, and he turns it from just being a simple flute to a truly expressive instrument. And it's great because he retains a lot of those kind of hack techniques that he had before. The highly rhythmic playing, and he still occasionally does the he does that stuff a little bit, for entertainment's sake. But it's the combination of those techniques that he developed for himself in the earlier days in the 70s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, and the proper technique, and the combination of those two elements. I mean, his flute playing is just absolutely incredible from this point on. I think it's a great shame, actually, that the records, the Jethro Tull records, from Roots to Branches onwards, don't get the same publicity amongst Tull fans. I think they're very well known amongst the fans, but those albums, they're the last two albums of entirely original material that would feature the name Jethro Tull. Those are the last two, Roots to Branches and jtull.com. And like I said, the flute playing on those albums is just, it's in space. He's really, really, really good. And he has remained really, really, really good. The other thing that I may throw into this video, because it's worth talking about, and I don't want to sound like Mr. Negativity, but is the issue of Ian Anderson's voice. It's something that's talked about amongst fans quite a bit. Obviously, in the early 70s, early mid-70s, he had just a wonderful voice. It was so expressive. It was so infused with character. He was like a roller coaster, the way that he used his voice. He was really, really good. He always slags himself off as a singer. And I mean, again, back in those early days, sure, he doesn't have a huge range. It's not like he can sing like 10 octaves or some crazy thing like that. But it's the character that he puts into his voice, which was just so perfect on albums like Thick as a Brick, Passion Play, Minstrel in the Gallery. And over time, that I think the fact that, again, Ian Anderson never actually took vocal training. He never actually, took the time to learn the proper techniques for singing. And years of touring without that training, I think, just blew his voice out. And it all came to a head in 1985, the tour for Under Wraps. Under Wraps was 1984. And that album I think has got the best example of Anderson's voice. Anderson sang beautifully on Under Wraps. And again, the material on that album is very challenging, and I think he blew his voice right out. He had to take some time off to let it recuperate, and in the late 80s and early 90s, with the kind of hard rock trilogy of albums, so that's Crest of a Knave, Rock Island, and Catfish Rising, generally we hear him kind of, he's starting to write songs that suit his reduced vocal abilities. And I think it came to a head with Catfish Rising, because he tried to get that character back out again, but the results weren't ideal. And my whole point about this, talking about Anderson's voice, is I think that, and I might be totally wrong here, but I think that could have possibly been a bit of the inspiration for him to relearn the flute, and bring his flute playing ability up to a stratospheric level. Because obviously that would be really limiting, especially a songwriter that's got such a great gift for these wonderful melodies. And, knowing that his voice was starting to give out at this point, he didn't have the ability to sing those melodies quite so much anymore. I mean, that must have been a terrible feeling. It must have been a very limiting feeling. So I think by taking the time to learn the flute and, apply the proper technique to it, as well as all the stuff that he had developed himself in the earlier days, I think by mastering that flute, he gave himself a whole new, he opened so many doors for himself as far as exploring melodies and instrumental kind of stuff, instrumentation and whatnot. And like I said, I'm not saying that his voice was totally toasted by this point, because I think on Roots to Branches, he sings very, very well on both Roots to Branches and on jtull.com. And I think he's just more aware of his vocal limitations. He knows where not to go. He's found this perfect little, bit of music, a bit of musical space where his voice will sound really good. And he keeps the vocal stuff there. But again, with his newfound flute playing that came on around this era, the musical quality, the quality of the instrumentation and the instrumental stuff, I think it goes up quite a bit. And the thing is, Jethro Tull's musical, their musical backgrounds, like the music behind the voice, was always really, really good and always very, very, very rich. But starting at this era, the mid '90s, it all goes up to another level. So it's kind of like we at this point, we've properly lost the classic Ian Anderson voice that we remember from the 70s and 80s, but we've gained this new flute player that is, you know, he's got to be one of the best in the world. He's got such a unique technique, and I mean, you listen to some of the flute playing that he's done since this period, you know, 95 or so, and there's nothing the guy can't play on the flute anymore. He really is a virtuoso flautist. So yeah, I mean that's my little chat. Again, I'm sorry I wasn't able to put Divinities up. Like I said, one day I will talk about Divinities. Like I said, I know I'm familiar enough with the material. It's just I don't feel right talking about it if I don't own the album. So I hope this was a good substitute for you, and if you just found this video and you haven't discovered any of my other chats, check it out. You know, go through my channel. I've got all the Tull albums up to this point, and I'm gonna have more Tull albums as well as some more Ian Anderson albums. We're getting close to the end of the career, but there's also some Gentle Giant videos up there. There's some Van de Graaff Generators, some Genesis, and there's gonna be more after the Tulls. So all this blah 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 blah. You have been graciously listening to me talk about Ian Anderson's flute playing and his voice, and how in the you know, early to mid 90s all of that stuff changed, and we ushered in a new era of excellence, which is going to pick up in my next video, where I talk about Roots to Branches, one of my favorite Tull albums, and I think it's one of the best ones, one that should be reevaluated, possibly. I think a lot of people hold it in high regard. Talk about that next time. Blah, 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 blah. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. Hit a subscribe. Send me a comment. Hit me a like. All that great stuff. Thanks again for listening, and we will see you all in the future. Cheers.